What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. I'm Josh, and we're back for yet another horror series ranking. Today we're going to be ranking every film in the Exorcist franchise from worst to best. I know in my Scream video I said that I was going to do my second favorite horror series next. This is not that. But I decided to cover this series first because we do have a new film in this franchise out right now, and it just felt a little more relevant to me. And I gotta be honest, there's a couple films on this list that I had not seen until a couple days ago. I sat down and watched them for the first time. I saw 1 through 3 a long time ago, obviously adore the first one, but the prequels I did watch for the first time a couple days ago, so the fact that I haven't rewatched them maybe will skew my opinion a little bit on those, but for the most part this is a ranking that I'm confident in. Remember, this is just my opinion. Be sure to drop your list down in the comments. This video will contain spoilers for all 6 of these films, and lastly, this video took a long time to put together, so if you did enjoy it, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see more like this. Yeah, I'm gonna have to disagree with Scorsese on this one. Now look, I sat down and rewatched The Exorcist 2 the other day because I feel like maybe I didn't give it a fair shot when I first saw it. I knew this movie had a really negative reception, and it was just as god-awful as I remember it being. It starts out not too bad. We're following this guy, Father Lamont, as he's investigating the death of Father Merrin in the first film. Meanwhile, Regan is now thriving. She's seeing a psychiatrist played by Louise Fletcher. But if you haven't seen this movie, prepare yourself. She has developed this revolutionary device called a synchronizer, which essentially, through hypnosis, allows people to see into each other's minds and dreams and have this weird brain linkage. You still with me? Because that's not even the weirdest thing in this film. No, it actually turns out that Regan has psychic healing abilities, and that's why Pazuzu possessed her in the first film. In the first Exorcist, part of what made it so scary is that this idea that evil can infest anything, even as innocent as this young, like 12 or 13-year-old girl. But this movie throws that all out the door and says that there is this subgroup of people who are prone to demonic possession, and the reason is that they have these psychic healing abilities. And I guess the reason Scorsese really enjoys this one is because he thinks it's a triumph of the idea that immense goodness invites evil by default. And it just doesn't come together as a cohesive film whatsoever. It doesn't feel like it belongs in this franchise, let alone with all of these weird sci-fi ideas. It is extremely unscary, and the way we learn about all these psychic abilities and through a bunch of backstory with Father Merrin is that we actually see flashbacks into his life through Regan's dreams. And then you've got James Earl Jones and a bunch of locusts and exposition from the demon itself. None of it makes any goddamn sense. And overall, this is just such a bizarre direction to take this franchise. I have no idea what anybody in the filmmaking process in this movie was thinking. It is undoubtedly the worst of the franchise and quite possibly one of my least favorite horror films of all time.
Be gone, evil spirit.
So for those who don't know the backstory behind these 2 prequel movies, essentially they're just 2 different versions of the same movie with some slight alterations. Essentially they hired this guy Paul Schrader to direct the first one. He shot the whole thing and gave a rough cut to the studio. They really didn't like it, so they actually fired him, brought on this guy Renny Harlin, who just, if you look at his filmography, he has a very different style. He completely rewrote and reshot the film, and that is the version that is this movie, The Exorcist: The Beginning. Now, the original director's cut from Paul Schrader did eventually get released. That's a film that we're going to talk about soon. To me, both of these are just different versions of a really bad film that absolutely did not need to exist. I guess the reason they remade the original prequel is that the studio thought Dominion was too dark and boring, and they wanted a more mainstream approach that would keep people more entertained, I guess. And yeah, I guess I'll say The Beginning is more stylized and better looking generally than the other version, but it's much less focused. There's a lot more side characters, there's a weird romance side plot, and some out-of-place action sequences. Who would have thought that's what we need to see in an Exorcist prequel? I'll talk more about the story when we get to Dominion, because I feel like that's the film that maybe executes this story marginally better. In this one, the supernatural stuff is dull, it's cheesy, and it makes 0 sense. I mean, you really don't see any of the main course possession stuff until the 3rd act, and I just found it all to be really ridiculous. Also, as much as I really dislike the other version, which we are soon about to talk about, this one has a lot more fake jump scares. You know, the type of thing where something jumps out and goes boo, and you're like, oh no, the characters are in danger. No, it just turned out to be a bunch of birds or some stupid shit. A lot of cheap tricks in this one, and I don't appreciate that.
You think your uniform will save you?
So as I said before, Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist, is the original version that was shot, shown to the studio, and they didn't like it, so they discarded it. But after poor reception to the beginning, they actually gave this a limited release. Although I don't think it was entirely finished, and you can definitely tell. I watched this on Peacock, but there were a lot of weird editing errors. I think overall the visuals are a little bit more monotone, which is the one thing that I think the beginning does better than this. But overall this film does feel a little bit more focused. The story here is largely the same though as the beginning. Essentially we're following Father Merrin. This is a prequel obviously to the first film, so we follow his backstory. He essentially moves to work on this archaeological dig in Kenya after he loses his faith, because essentially he's being haunted by this guilt that he feels over this encounter he had with Nazi soldiers in a Netherlands village, in which they forced him to choose civilians for them to execute, which, it plants a seed there that I think is actually kind of interesting. But really, this is an example of a prequel that answers questions that I don't need answered whatsoever, not to mention the fact that the entire first 2/3 are really boring. This village outcast dude, I think his name was Cheche, he gets possessed. In the beginning, it was the woman that he was kind of attracted to, so at least there was a little more of a connection between the two of them in there. Here, it's just ridiculous. He goes for the bald look eventually when he's fully possessed, and it doesn't look scary whatsoever. And the third act definitely goes off the rails with some really fantastical visuals, laughable CGI, especially there's a bunch of CGI animals in this, like hyenas and snakes, and they look terrible. Again, that's why I feel that this version was maybe not actually fully finished. Like, really the best way I can explain this is imagine the first Exorcist, but the entire film was spent in Iraq. I don't know, the Kenyan deserts just don't have the same feel to me as that real civilized feel that the first film had, where you're like, oh wow, so this can happen anywhere. It doesn't matter how many people are around, you're not safe. I do like Stellan Skarsgård as Father Merrin. I think he does a decent job of picking up the mantle and doing what he can with it, but this movie just doesn't really give him much to work with that's coherent. It is a tad bit more focused than the beginning, but I don't really think it's much better. Once again, they're just two slightly different versions of the same shitty film.
People have died on both sides of possession.
Come home, baby. Come back to us, okay?
If you don't make it, I don't make it.
It really does sadden me that we're at number 3 already and The Exorcist Believer has made it this far. And I mentioned in my review that I didn't hate this film, but to me it really does feel like the more generic, studio-driven horror film. It's trying to be a legacy sequel, but it's also trying to introduce a few new ideas, and quite frankly, the first act is when I was most engaged, when it was more of a missing person story. And you see the early stages of possession where the girls are just acting slightly off. I think those work pretty well. But even those scenes have some ridiculous moments, like that one scene where Angela attacks her father by wrapping a shirt around him and slamming him into the ground. As soon as the actual exorcism started, this movie just plummeted in quality for me. It sort of took a more is better approach to this franchise, as in we have 2 possessed girls this time, we have a bunch of priests and representatives from various different denominations of religion, and more is not better by default. And in this third act, there are just so many characters that pop up that we've really never seen or gotten to know before, and all of a sudden they're supposed to be really important to the story, so I didn't feel anything for the priest that died. The arc for our main character, Victor, did not really come full circle. I understand that this is a similar film to the first, and that it's mirroring the storyline with Karis, and that he's supposed to be finding his way back to faith, but I don't feel like they really completed it. And the fact that one of the girls died was just not a very good twist. This movie just doesn't have much of a distinct identity, and that's a real shame. The real travesty, though, is Ellen Burstyn being totally wasted. In fact, I think they were kind of disrespectful to give her a dumb enough storyline in which she attempts her own exorcism only to be blinded when Catherine stabs her in the eyes. To make matters worse, Reagan shows up at the end for no apparent reason, just to bait people into coming to see the next one. Also, as good of an actress as Ann Dowd is, her monologue at the end of this was painful to listen to. It was really trying to be so profound, and in actuality, it left me on a really sour note. I mean, all of the dialogue in this scene is just a bunch of obnoxious, existential nothingness. So yeah, 4 films in on this list now, and I would still say this is a pretty shitty film. Thankfully, I think it's safe to say there's a huge gap between my number 3 and my number 2.
You begetter of death, sworn enemy of all the human race.
It took me a while to watch The Exorcist 3, and I'm really glad I did. I had always heard great things about it, but I had never heard, it's one of the great horror movies of its era. And I'm not saying this film is flawless, but it is miles better than any of the other sequels in this franchise. And I think it means a lot that this was directed and written by William Peter Blatty, who wrote the original Exorcist novel. He also wrote Legion, which is the novel that is a sequel to his book. and this is essentially the adaptation of that book. And this one follows Lieutenant Kinderman from the first film, this time played excellently by George C. Scott. And he's investigating the Gemini killer. I really like the ideas in this one of this demon possessing different people at night in this mental institution in order to commit murders.
Tell the press that I am the Gemini Lieutenant, or I will punish you. Punish me? Yes.
Also, I have to mention the fact that this movie contains one of the greatest jump scares of all time. I mean, the build-up, the false scare that you might think at first is kind of cheap, but then you're like, oh no, it's meant to lull you into a false sense of security, so the real scare will send shivers straight down your spine, and it absolutely does. I guess the studio wasn't happy with the original cut, so they forced Blatty to add in an exorcism scene in the third act, which wasn't originally there. And I know studio intervention is generally not a good thing, but I think it makes sense in this case. It is an Exorcist movie, it should probably have an exorcism scene. And the one that we do get here is actually pretty good. A lot of excellent cinematography, some nasty gore, and great eerie visuals. This entire film is really well shot, and I think it's genuinely pretty scary, which I cannot say about a single other sequel on this list. So if you have not seen The Exorcist 3, you're missing out. Go check it out.
Keep away! The soul is mine!
This is another horror franchise where I don't see an argument for putting any film at number 1, even part 3, which I know I said is pretty great. But the original is absolutely a masterpiece in my eyes. It's one of the scariest films ever made. I know a lot of people think it's actually pretty tame by today's standards, but for the most part, I think it's aged pretty well. Even if it doesn't scare you though, you have to acknowledge the fact that this contributed in large to the satanic panic of the late 70s and early 80s. I mean, it was such a huge controversial deal when it came out, not only because of some of the things that are said and done in the film, but because it sent people in droves fleeing from the theater, vomiting, fainting. Obviously, some of those things are probably exaggerated. But still, the fact that a film could do that and send people into this immense state of fear that if they go and see this, they're actually putting themselves at risk for demonic possession. It is very scary, but it's also a very grounded human drama about a man dealing with a crisis of faith and a desperate mother trying to save her daughter from a condition that science refuses to explain. This movie is also meticulously paced. I mean, the scariest scenes to me are when Reagan just starts acting slightly off, and the doctors believe she's just having a rare psychological episode. And Ellen Burstyn is great at putting you in the shoes of this mother who is just in an absolute panic. There's nothing she can do for her daughter. She doesn't want to put her in an institution. And she's also not a very religious person, so she doesn't necessarily turn to this idea of demonic possession until all of her other options have been exhausted. And I also really love the detail about William Friedkin's comments about interpreting this movie. He said before that you could see this as a film about hopelessness or hopefulness depending on your just mindset. On one hand, this demon caused a priest to commit suicide, which is probably considered a great victory for evil and Satan, but also a young girl's life was saved, a young girl who most people would say probably looked like she was too far gone. And I just love that you can watch this and knowing his comments interpret it those two different ways. But there's not much else I can say about this film that hasn't already been said. It's fucking awesome. Go check it out if you haven't seen it. It's definitely one of my favorite horror movies of all time. I mean, some of the things that are said and done by this like 13-year-old girl in this film had never been done before, and they were so disturbing to audiences then, and I think they're still disturbing today. So that is my ranking of every film in the Exorcist franchise from worst to best. As always, once again, drop your list down below. I want to see what you guys think. Are the prequels underrated? I don't know. Maybe some people actually really like them. As far as The Heretic and Believer go, it doesn't seem like there's much of a cult following for either of those. And I still don't think it was worth it to turn this into a full-blown franchise, but I do really like 3, and obviously 1 is above them all. That's going to do it for this one, guys. Be sure to stay tuned for the next video, which will be ranking my second favorite horror movie franchise of all time right behind Scream. Thanks for checking this video out. I'll see you then.